Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Today on the pod, we are talking about journalists. The real old-fashioned gumshoe types with a pad in their hand and a chip on their shoulder. In a bit, we'll hear from New Yorker writer Calvin Trillin talking about his book chronicling the lives of some more, offbeat reporters, which is saying a lot considering who we're talking about here. But first, journalists aren't in the business of myth-making. Quite the opposite, really. And Jennet Conant's book, Fierce Ambition, resists waxing nostalgic on some good old days of journalism. It's a biography of Maggie Higgins, an important barrier-breaking war reporter who was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for foreign correspondence. And yeah, she helped pave the way for a lot of women afterwards. But Conant tells NPR's Mary Louise Kelly that was just a byproduct of her looking out for herself. That's ahead.
This message comes from Apple Card. Earn 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new Apple Vision Pro or any products at Apple, and automatically grow your daily cash at 4.50% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings accounts by Goldman Sachs Bank USA. Member FDIC. Terms apply.
We're going to spend these next several minutes on the remarkable life of Maggie Higgins. Higgins was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for foreign correspondence. She helped to change war reporting, both what kind of stories journalists were filing and by helping kick open the door for other women. And she is the subject of the new biography, Fierce Ambition, The Life and Legend of War Correspondent Maggie Higgins. The author is Jennet Conant, and she's with me now. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So you open this book with one of her hardest assignments, I suppose certainly the one that made her name, the liberation of Dachau, the concentration camp where in Germany, 1945, and Maggie Higgins is this cub reporter for the New York Herald Tribune. How did she come to cover Dachau?
Well, she was dying to cover the major stories of the war, but women were barred from the combat zone. So she had become increasingly frustrated, cooling her heels behind the lines. And she heard that the camp might be liberated. And she knew it was going to be one of the biggest stories of the war. So she talked a young Stars and Stripes correspondent into letting her ride in his Jeep. And they dashed across occupied territory ahead of the Third Army in hopes of being the first at Dachau. And they made it, and they were among the very first to enter the camp, and it was a truly, gruesome and a terrible spectacle.
Yeah, I'm wondering there's nothing that could prepare any human for the sight that awaited them, but for a very young rookie war correspondent, how did she navigate that? How did she capture it in the story that she filed?
Well, she had been among the first reporters to enter Buchenwald just a few weeks earlier. So she, in a sense, knew more than even most of the liberating troops because some of them had never been to a concentration camp before. So she steeled herself for the worst, but she said later that nothing could have prepared her, for the sight that awaited them. Outside the main camp, they came across an abandoned train, and there were some 40 cattle cars filled with dead men, women, and children, still in their striped prisoner uniforms. They had been left there to starve to death, to die of the cold. It was a staggering sight, but they had to press on to go further into the camp to liberate the prisoners. Maggie was one of the first in. The men, half-starved, dying, desperate, of course, were overjoyed to see her. She spoke several languages, and she said, "Du bist frei, you're free." And pandemonium ensued. They picked her up, they threw her in the air, they hugged her, they kissed her. She brought them the news that they had been waiting for. So it was one of the most emotional, tumultuous moments of the war, and she recorded it on the front pages of the New York Herald Tribune, and the story did make her famous overnight.
Yeah. She won the Pulitzer Prize for covering a different war, the Korean War. What stands out to you about how she covered that? What stories she found worth telling?
Well, she earned a reputation, starting with Dachau, for sort of reckless disregard for her personal safety. She would insist on going where the action was, on going with the troops and covering the battles. And in Korea, it was particularly dangerous. More correspondents died in a few months of Korea than in the entirety of World War II. It was a very dangerous war. And she kept covering the combat and going right to the front lines. And she went into Incheon with the Marines. She covered the fifth wave. They were trapped against a seawall. The enemy was rolling grenades down. They were harassed by sniper fire. And men fell around her, and miraculously, she survived, and she covered the combat the way very few did, and certainly in Korea, no other woman. So because she was the only woman doing that at a time when women weren't even allowed, it was an enormous feat. She won the Pulitzer for her daring dispatches, and the Pulitzer Committee noted that she won it under extraordinary difficult circumstances because she was a woman, but she did not want that to be what she was known for. She wanted to be seen as a good newspaper man, not woman. So she didn't want to be distinguished for her sex.
I mean, she did, people listening will be gathering why I introduced this by saying she did help kick open the door for other women. And so I was interested to read by your account that other women journalists didn't really seem to like her very much.
No, because she was singularly unsisterly. You know, she wanted to be one of the guys. She wasn't a feminist per se. She just wanted equal opportunity for herself, not for her sex. And so she broke down the doors because of her unbridled ambition. She wanted to be allowed to cover every story the way her competitors were allowed to. And I don't think she was interested in sharing the glory with another woman. I think that said, also, she was very tough, but she wasn't particularly generous, I don't think, in helping the younger generation. But a lot of those pioneering women, you know, they developed very thick skins to get where they were. And they were impatient and tough and very single-minded, focused on their own career, their own mission, and not much else.
Her professional success came at a personal cost, and a good deal of your book focuses on her personal life. Why? Why important to include all of that?
Because I didn't want to just glamorize the idea of some badass war babe, you know, the fearless, intrepid Maggie Higgins. There was enough of that myth-making in her own lifetime. She suffered a lot because she was unusually attractive for her profession. She was a very beautiful blonde, and it was a very feminine look for a very unfeminine job. And it brought her enormous scrutiny, more scrutiny arguably than a woman who looked another way might have gotten. And she knew it was partly responsible for her fame. It also was responsible for some of the nastiest, most venomous gossip you can imagine. Her male competitors accused her of advancing on her back. Anything that she did that got her an exclusive or allowed her to beat her competitors was immediately dismissed as something she got, you know, with more than lowered lashes, as they used to say. I wanted to really show how tough it was, the toll that it can take, and how women are just judged for everything, from their appearance to their conduct, in a way that is just still much tougher than it is for the men.
I wonder if she could whisper across generations to the current crop of war correspondents chronicling events in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and beyond. What words of advice do you think Maggie Higgins might offer?
I think she would tell them, don't listen, don't care, don't let it stop you. Because I think that's what distinguishes Maggie more than anything. She had this ferocious ambition, and she didn't let all the abuse that she had to take keep her from her goals, and she achieved them.
Jennet Conant is the author of Fierce Ambition, The Life and Legend of War Correspondent Maggie Higgins. Thank you.
Thank you.
This message comes from NPR sponsor BetterHelp. No relationship is easy all the time. In fact, the best friendships, partnerships, and family connections come from putting in the time and effort to make them great. Give your relationships some love with BetterHelp's convenient, affordable online therapy. Visit BetterHelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/NPR.
All right, well, Conant did cover some of the darker aspects of the job. Being a reporter can be fun as hell. NPR's Scott Simon spoke to Calvin Trillin about his book, The Lede, about a handful of different reporters. And I think from this interview, you can tell that it's a point of pride for Trillin that reporters tend to be the kind of raggedy bunch who don't really look comfortable at fancy pants events.
The news, about the business of journalism, is filled with layoffs, buyouts, and bankruptcies. The Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Sports Illustrated, Time, National Geographic, The Wall Street Journal, we could go on. What a time for Calvin Trillin, the fabled author, humorist, and New Yorker writer, to come out with a collection of some of his reporting on reporters over the years. Crime beat chroniclers, eccentric editors, word lyricists, columnists, and more. His new collection, The Lede, L-E-D-E, that expression in journalism for an opening paragraph, dispatches from a life in the press. Calvin Trillin joins us now from New York. Mr. Trillin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I learned in this collection that we share one practical skill, and speaking for myself, it's the only practical skill I have. I can't even drive a car, and that's typing.
Yes, I'm a wizard at the typewriter. I make a lot of mistakes, but I type very quickly. That's because my father in Kansas City, where I grew up, when the schools ended rather early one year because they ran out of money, he sent me and my sister to secretarial school. I used to think of my father's aspirations for me as he wanted me to be president of the United States and that I not become a ward of the county. But neither one of those required typing, so I like to think maybe he was pushing me toward journalism.
Yeah. Wonderful profile in this collection of Edna Buchanan, the longtime police beat reporter in Miami. Maybe her best-known book is The Corpse Had a Familiar Face. What made her a great crime reporter?
She was relentless. She was asking questions after you thought that the conversation was over. And she talked to me once about calling the next of kin of somebody who had just been murdered. Mm-hmm. And if somebody accused her of being just a ghoul and a vulture for calling at such a time and hung up on her, she counted to 60, and then she called again. She figured that by that time, somebody might have said, you should have talked to that reporter, or maybe somebody else would answer the phone who was more talkative.
You also have a long, good section on R.W. Johnny Apple of the New York Times. Respected and feared political reporter for years, had been a war correspondent in Vietnam. He eventually became best known in his later years for inventing, would it be fair to call it, the most envied beat in journalism?
I think that would be fair. He also, in addition to the envied beat, he had an envied expense account.
Yeah. Well, it struck me, of course, you have been famous also for writing about food, but it's often Kansas City barbecue places or Texas barbecue places. Johnny Apple ranged around the world writing about food, and often not in humble barbecue places.
No, he entered the places. I think when people talked about Apple, when he entered one of those restaurants, the verb they usually used was he swept in. He wasn't one of those shy food people who don't want you to know that they're there.
And what do you think we can learn from Johnny Apple in journalism today?
Well, it's a different business, of course, and Johnny, in a way, was at sort of beginning of the new business because in the old days, people thought of newspaper reporters as guys with a bottle of bourbon in the lower right-hand drawer and a sort of a greasy hat and a notebook. And then sooner or later, journalists got to be people who had, like Johnny, gone to Princeton. Although I have to say he never graduated. He was the editor of the paper, and he thought that being the editor of the paper was in lieu of going to class or writing papers or anything like that.
What do you think about journalism these days?
Well, it's a different game. I think about how many reporters, say, I don't know, the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post has at City Hall. And there's a big difference. On the other hand, there are a lot of people with various ways of communicating that we didn't used to have. I don't know how I would have felt about it when I was first starting out, when I worked for Time magazine in the South. Also, it sort of turned reporters into wire service reporters because it could be in the digital at any time, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure it would have been as appealing to me as it was. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it would have been appealing to me if there hadn't been a subject that dominated what I was writing about. And in my case, it was the desegregation struggle in the South.
Yeah, the civil rights movement. Yeah. You mentioned Johnny Apple going to Princeton, and of course you were at Yale. Should there be more journalists with greasy hats and bourbon in their drawers?
Well, I hadn't thought
that. That sounds vaguely dirty. And bourbon in the bottom drawer of their desk?
That's right. I once published a book on travel, and there are various stories in it, and some reviewer said, apparently not knowing as much as Johnny Apple knew about expense accounts, that these trips were available only to someone like the author who's in the upper middle class. And I called my sister in Kansas City and said, we finally made it. I think when reporters get too full of themselves, for instance, it's something like the Gridiron Dinner when they invite celebrities and everything like that, even though they have a tux on, they're really somewhere between the people who own the tux and the guy who's doing valet parking. Reporters, they're not a very classy bunch. They're often asked to leave places, and they interrupt people when the people are trying to do their jobs. So I think somewhere in the middle.
Calvin Trillin, his new collection, The Lede, Dispatches from a Life in the Press. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Scott.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. Let us know what you think. You can write to us at bookoftheday@npr.org. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Isabella Gomez Sarmiento and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Samantha Balaban, Melissa Gray, Audrey Wynn, Megan Kane, Todd Munt, Emiko Tamagawa, Shannon Rhodes, Erica Ryan, Justine Kennan, Ed McNulty, and Danny Hensel. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
This message comes from the New Yorker Fiction Podcast. What makes a short story work? Explore the minds of writers like Otessa Moshfegh and George Saunders on the New Yorker Fiction Podcast to find out. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Sony Pictures Classics with Amelie. Get ready to be charmed again when Amelie returns to theaters on Valentine's Day. Now is your chance to see the cinematic sensation on the big screen for a limited time.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.